Welcome to video 2 in our Heart as a Pump lesson. So, to start this video, let's take a look at our old familiar friend, the Wiggers diagram. You can see that here. We have left atrial pressure, red is ventricular pressure, orange is aortic pressure here, and you will note that I could construct a similar graph. This is on the left. I could construct a similar one on the right. The same things are happening on the right as the left. You know that this is the left because you can look at the pressures. We have 120 peak systolic. We have 80 minimum diastolic. If this were the right-hand side, all those pressures would be lower, right? We've got our EKG up here, we've got our heart sounds, we've got our ventricular volume, okay? It's all there. Now, we're going to add a twist to this. If I simultaneously measure volume here and ventricular pressure here, I can graph them against one another. And that is what you see here, left ventricular pressure on the y-axis and left ventricular volume on the x, okay? And you can actually do this clinically. You can measure, it's been done, and I'll show you some data. You can measure volume with an echo and make a good estimate, and then you can measure pressure with a catheter. If you measure them simultaneously, you get what's called a pressure volume loop, which is what you see here. And I'm going to take you through this loop, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simultaneously go through the Wiggers diagram here and go through this loop. So let's start here. Here is where my mitral valve on the left opens. You know that because left ventricular pressure falls below left atrial pressure in purple, and left ventricular filling starts. Okay? So this corresponds to point D on this graph. I have a minimum left ventricular volume because I haven't started filling yet, and I have a low left ventricular pressure because my pressure has been falling, my cardiac muscle has been relaxing, okay? So we know point D is the same as this point here. The mitral valve is opening on this corner, okay? And we're about to start filling. So we are going to go counterclockwise around this loop. Okay, so we're going to go from point D to point A, and we're going to start filling our ventricle. And as we fill our ventricle, you can see the volume is going to go up, right? So here is point A. My ventricle has filled, my volume has gone up. My pressure has gone up just slightly because I've blown my ventricle up like a balloon, and I've stretched my cardiac fibers in my wall while I'm doing that, recall, okay? So this corresponds to point A, okay? We've just got done filling the heart, and now we're about to start contraction, okay? So after point A, my ventricular pressure goes up and exceeds atrial pressure. My mitral valve closes. Blood wants to flow from the ventricle into the atria. My valve won't let it happen. I hear S1 at this point. And my ventricle has started to depolarize and I've started to contract, okay? So next, we have contraction going on and we have isovolumetric contraction. Remember, both valves are closed between these two dashed lines, okay? Aortic valve is closed because the ventricular pressure is lower than aortic pressure. The mitral valve is closed because the ventricular pressure is higher than the atrial pressure. Isovolumetric contraction, force is going up, volume is not changing. And look what happens here. We go from A to B. Force goes up, pressure in the ventricle goes up, no change in volume. A to B. Isovolumetric contraction. Okay? At that point, my aortic valve opens and I begin to eject blood. My left ventricular volume falls. My pressure continues to rise a little bit. And my volume certainly goes down, and I go from B to C in my ventricular pressure volume loop, okay? And this is point C here, where the aortic valve is now closing because my ventricular pressure is falling below my aortic pressure. Blood wants to flow from the aorta back into the ventricle. The valve closes and won't let it, okay? And then I get this drop in pressure with no change in volume, and that is our isovolumetric relaxation from C to D on your graph here, okay? And we've gone around the loop as we've gone through the cardiac cycle, okay? That's our pressure volume loop, all right? And this is sort of what it looks like on an echo. This is actually a mouse. You can see the volumes are really small. It's not a great example. I did finally find one that's better, and it's actually human. And I'll show you that one later on in the lesson, okay? But one thing I do want you to notice, see these loops? This is just like one single loop. It makes you look like it's just doing this over and over again, right? One loop right on top of another. The truth of the matter is that as I move around up here, my preload, the degree of filling in my heart is varying from beat to beat just a little bit, because I'm compressing my blood volume, my blood vessels, and I'm moving around. There are little changes taking place in the system here and there. So what you end up with is not one stereotypical loop. You end up with a series of loops that you see here. And that's why you see a bunch of these dashed lines. It's because these loops kind of, these loops vary from beat to beat, okay, with the preload. I'll show you that in a second. One thing I want you to notice is this end systolic pressure volume relation. I will show you later in the lesson, as this loop varies from beat to beat and as the preload varies, you find out that this end systolic pressure point goes up and down along this relationship, and it makes a straight line, and that's what you see here. That relationship makes a straight line in control, all right? I'll show you better examples in a moment, okay? Okay, so we've got our heart, it's beating from beat to beat, and you're getting your stroke volume here. And as you guys know, alterations in stroke volume will give you alterations in cardiac output, and so will alterations in heart rate. So both of these will change the cardiac output. If this goes up, this goes up. If this goes up, this goes up, right? All right. First thing I want you to notice, here's our equation, and you have to memorize this one. You have to be able to manipulate it. It's not brain surgery, right? Cardiac output is equal to stroke volume times heart rate. This is a causal relationship. Your body will change stroke volume and heart rate in order to get a change in cardiac output, okay? That is a causal relationship. On our left, your body changes these in order to affect a change in the parameter on the right. This is not a causal relationship. It is mathematically true. If I gave you the cardiac output and the heart rate, you could calculate stroke volume. But it's not a physiologically relevant causal relationship. Your body does not change cardiac output in order to attain a given stroke volume, in order to affect a change in stroke volume, okay? Your body doesn't care about stroke volume. As you're going to find out in a little while, the only thing your body really cares about is mean arterial pressure. But your body actually directly changes these two things. It does not directly change this, okay? So this is not a causal relationship. In order for it to be a causal relationship, your body would have to directly be able to change one of these two parameters, okay? All right. Note that there are three things that change the stroke volume. The preload, or the filling, and this is related to our Frank-Starling relationship. The intratropic state, or the contractility, related to the intratropic state or contractility of the cardiac muscle, and the afterload, related to the afterload on our cardiac muscle. An increase in this increases stroke volume, an increase in this increases stroke volume, an increase in this decreases stroke volume, okay? So let's talk about that. Heart rate and stroke volume both affect cardiac output. And notice that when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, you can vary the heart rate quite a bit. Well, between a low of 40 and a high of 180, with about 70 being normal. Okay. Stroke volume, on the other hand, doesn't change that much. It changes, okay, you can do it, but it changes only a range of about 1.5-fold as opposed to a range of about 4.5-fold here. And with normal being sort of in this range, okay? With normal really being, closer to 75 than anything else, I think some of these ranges look a little high. Anyway, not important. Heart rate is the physiologically dominant determinant of cardiac output, and that is because you can change your heart rate a lot more than you can change your stroke volume. Okay, if you increase sympathetic tone, it will cause a bigger change in heart rate relatively than it will in stroke volume relatively. So heart rate is the physiologically predominant parameter, and that'll become important to you in a later lesson. For right now, just remember it. Okay. So how does this all work? Well, let's talk about the change in filling first. All right. So if I increase my diastolic volume, okay, down here, that increases the cardiac fiber length in the walls of my ventricle because I am stretching the walls of my ventricle more. Okay. If I increase the fiber length, the cardiac cell length, then I increase the force of contraction through Frank Starling. Okay. That's what you see here. If I increase force of contraction, I increase stroke volume. A lot of people want to know what stroke work is. It's a parameter that concerns physiologists more than anything else. You do not have to worry about it. Just figure it's equivalent to stroke volume, okay? It's not. You can look it up if you want. You can ask me if you want. But for our purposes, for the purposes of this lesson, they're the same, all right? And that gives you an increase in cardiac output. So this relationship, there are a bunch of different things that are equivalent to increases in diastolic fiber length or increases in cardiac muscle length, okay? And the more you stretch that, these are all indications that you stretch the muscle more. Atrial pressure as well. If I increase the atrial pressure, I'm increasing the filling. If I'm increasing the filling, I'm increasing the stretch in the muscle. Okay, and I'm increasing the diastolic volume and pressure. So these are all equivalent, okay? Increases in any of these are an indication that you are increasing these, which is stroke volume and cardiac output, okay? Okay. Stroke volume is predominantly determined by filling. It is the major factor, okay? It affects stroke volume more than contractility does, and certainly more than afterload does, okay? All right, so let's take a look at our dilated cardiomyopathy patient. She's got low blood pressure, right? Better know if that's low. She's got a really, really low fractional ejection. Remember, normal is much, much higher than this, okay? So let's take a look at why that might be. Here's our echo, okay? And we have our big enlarged ventricle here, all right? And you guys will remember from the hemodynamics lesson and the hemodynamics program that I gave you, the law of Laplace, which says that wall tension is equal to pressure times radius divided by wall thickness. So if I increase the radius of this ventricle, I increase the wall tension, which means I increase the stretch on the walls and I increase the stretch of the cardiac muscle cells, which is good. That means that I've got a diseased heart and I'm actually doing something to increase the force of contraction and keep that stroke volume up. So that helps, okay? Hearts get bigger when you're in heart failure. Generally speaking, increases in radius will increase the force of contraction. Generally speaking, you would consider that to be a good thing, okay? Increased force of contraction increases oxygen demand. You've got a low blood pressure, which means you've got a low perfusing pressure through your coronaries, which means you're having a hard time supplying this muscle with oxygen. So at a time when you have decreased supply, you're increasing demand. That is bad, okay? So we've got good and we've got bad here. That's bad. Increased demand. This is the problem that your body has when it comes to heart failure. Okay, it can try to increase the force of contraction, but if you're in congestive heart failure, if your heart's not functioning correctly, the odds are good you're having a hard time perfusing that heart with blood, which means that as you increase the force of contraction, you're also increasing the demand, which means you're making the problem worse. Okay, so good, bad, this is all ugly. Okay, and then finally, the heart has to contract against the increased wall tension. The more tension you put on the walls, the more the harder the cardiac cell has to work to contract against it. So that means you're making your cardiac cell work harder because of that. Okay? So in extreme cases, you can't completely overcome it. So in the end, you get a reduced ejection fraction, which means you've really decreased your stroke volume, which is bad. Okay? So these are the problems these are the special problems that the heart runs into in heart disease. And this is why what I'm teaching you is relevant, because this probably seemed like a pretty abstract concept when you were exposed to it. It's not, it really actually kind of applies. All right. Let's take a look at contractility. So here is our control ventricle. And this is increasing end diastolic pressure. Remember, this could have been end diastolic volume. It could have been atrial pressure. They're all indications of filling. And as the pressure, the end ventricular pressure, the end diastolic ventricular pressure goes up, I get an increased force of contraction, which means I get an increased stroke volume. Okay? Now, if I take the same level of filling, the same left ventricular end diastolic pressure, and I go to a heart where the same heart where I gave the patient norepinephrine, I get more force of contraction and a higher stroke volume. Okay, so I get an upward shift in the Starling curve, the Frank-Starling relationship. I get an upward shift in our ventricular function. The stroke volume that I get is a function of left ventricular end diastolic pressure. Okay, basically an increase in stroke volume at the same filling, degree of filling. Okay, this is an increase in contractility in the heart. Okay, I think that makes sense. This is Frank-Starling. This is a normal heart. These are normal changes in stroke volume as you go up and down this relationship. If I shift the relationship, now that's something that's changed the state of the muscle that as a doctor you need to be aware of. It means that I've done something to increase the degree of contraction or decrease it. Okay? Practically speaking, changes in contractility don't really increase the stroke volume. What they do is they limit the fall in stroke volume. We'll talk more about that when we talk about CircSim and we talk about the CircSim computer lab, which I expect you guys, I certainly hope you guys will be there and do, because it brings together a lot of complex relationships and sort of helps you put it all together. When you put it all together, what you're going to find out is that what's really happening when you increase contractility is you're limiting the fall in stroke volume. Don't worry about it excessively now. That's just the way it is. All right. So here's Wager's diagram again. Here is our ventricular volume and pressure, so our pressure volume loop. We start at point D. The mitral valve is just closed and we're just about to begin filling. We fill, our volume goes up, our pressure goes up just slightly as we blow up our ventricle and we stretch our cardiac fibers, our cardiac muscle cells. We begin ventricular contraction, both valves are closed, isovolumetric contraction, same volume, increased pressure, and we hit point B, and then we start ejection, our volume goes back down again until our pressure, ventricular pressure, falls below the aortic pressure. our aortic valve closes, and we begin isovolumetric relaxation, same volume, pressure dropping. Okay. All right, we end up at point D again. All right, now, you might get the impression that what happens here is this loop goes around and around with that loop superimposed, and you have an identical loop in a person, you know, every beat, steady state. As I said earlier, the reality is that your preload varies a little bit every time you move around, every time you do something, every time you breathe. Okay, it changes a little bit, the degree of filling. So what you typically don't get is you don't get one stereotypic curve, you get a series of curves that kind of move around. So if A is my heart, and a typical pressure volume loop, and let's say for some reason the preload goes up, for some normal reason, okay? I took a step or I took a breath or something. Now I get the purple curve where I generate more pressure and I eject more blood, but if you look at the end systolic pressure and volume for the red and the purple, and if I do it even more with the green, those points fall on this end systolic pressure volume relationship, okay? And as long as I don't change the inotropic state of the muscle, as long as the muscle is the same and it's just operating with Frank Starling, this relationship doesn't change and all those points fall along the same line. This is a mouse, it's kind of not a very good example, but I'll show you a better example on a dog in a second. So if I change the contractility or the inotropic state, okay, what I get is if I change the contractility or the inotropic state, what I get is a shift in this end systolic pressure and volume relationship. So look here. Here we have a heart. It's filling to the same left ventricular volume. So our distension of our ventricle is the same. Okay. Our control heart in purple does this, and our end systolic pressure volume relationship runs right through there. And the preload could vary a little bit, and it would all run through there. Okay. If I change the inotropic state, if I increase the contractility by giving a drug, okay, what you get is a shift in the end systolic pressure volume relationship upward and to the left. Okay, and you can see that here. All right. So this is a normal variation in the pressure volume. And what you get are a series of curves, and you could do this in any patient. And that's what you'd see. You'd see a series of curves. Here, if you actually shift that relationship, that means that something's happening with the heart. That means you give a drug, or if the shift is in the opposite direction, it means there's a decrease in contractility. All right. So let's take a look at our dilated cardiomyopathy patient. She is in a negative inotropic state. So here's our pressure-volume relationship, and where do you think her pressure-volume curve would sit? And if I were to draw this and just estimate it, I'd say it would probably look something like that. So here's our normal end systolic pressure-volume relationship. All of our volumes are going to be shifted up because it's a big fat ventricle, right? And our inotropic state of our cardiac muscle is down. So at the same filling, we're going to have a lower force of contraction, a lower stroke volume. So you're going to get a relationship that might be something like this, where your end systolic pressure volume relation, or your end systolic pressure volume relationship has shifted rightward and downward. Okay, like this. See that? If we had increased the inotropic state, it would be upward and to the left. decreased inotropic state, say with heart disease, downward and to the right. Okay, so that's how this relationship shifts with a pressure volume curve. And that's how you can tell a normal variation in the way that the heart is functioning and something that's abnormal. Okay, that relationship shifts around. All right, here is dog. I'm pretty sure this is dog. We have congestive heart failure dog. Okay, and these are the pressure volume loops, and you can see that as the dog breathes or walks around, whatever, probably breathing, you get variations in the preload, and you get variations in the way that this loop looks, but all of the end systolic pressure and volumes, they all fall along a curve like this. Okay. Now you give that dog a drug that increases the contractility of the muscle, and this relationship shifts upward and to the left. And now that same dog has a different relationship, and you can see now our series of curves with our end systolic pressure and volumes, now these points are all on a new line. The line is shifted leftward. So here's our normal end systolic pressure volume relationship. If the inotropic state or the contractility of the muscle goes up, say because you gave the patient a drug, it shifts this way, upward and to the left. If the patient is in a disease state or something else is going on that decreases the contractility, you get a shift to the right and down. Okay? All right. Finally, we can put this on a three-dimensional graph. Okay? This is cardiac output. You can imagine it says stroke volume. It's the same sort of relationship. Okay? On this x-axis, we have mean arterial pressure, which is an indication of afterload, increases in pressure, increased afterload. This stands for mean left atrial pressure, okay? As we go along this axis, we get an increase in atrial pressure. So it's a 3D graph. In order to make this a little easier to see, this axis is the same as this, okay? And what you see as the left atrial pressure goes up, we get an increase in stroke volume, okay, along this red line. As this goes that way, this goes up, okay? So that is your Frank-Starling relationship, your increased preload, okay? If we look at the effect of increasing afterload at a given preload, at any given preload, we get this line. And again, I think this is a dog. So we're increasing pressure, and notice how high the pressure has to get before stroke volume starts to finally fall. It has to get really high. So remember I told you that after load, qualitatively, you always get a fall in stroke volume with an increase in afterload. However, quantitatively, it doesn't amount to much unless you get to really, really, really high pressures, okay? It doesn't really drop, and you can see that on this graph, okay? All right. And that's because of homeometric autoregulation, okay? I increase the afterload, I have more volume left over in my ventricle after that contraction against the increased afterload. If I have more volume left over, that means I have an increased end systolic volume. If I increase the end systolic volume, when I fill back up again, I'm going to end up at a higher volume because I started at a higher volume. So my end diastolic volume will go up. If my end diastolic volume goes up, I blow my ventricles up like a balloon more. And that means I stretch my cardiac cells more. And that means that I increase the force of contraction of those cardiac cells, which means I increase the stroke volume back up toward normal through the Frank-Starling relationship. Okay? So increased afterload decreases the stroke volume, but the homeometric autoregulation kicks in and the stroke volume comes back up, almost where it was before the increased afterload, okay? And so that limits the effect of afterload on stroke volume. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you for your attention, and that's the end of this lesson. I'll see you guys in the rooms.